Hello and welcome to the Wall Street Journal at large. We're well used to the left's domination of the media, entertainment and academic elites in this country. For years, it's been harder to find a conservative in a major newsroom, a Hollywood studio or a university faculty than it was to find a Yankee fan in Boston. As a result, the cultural discourse here has skewed heavily to the left. And in recent years, of course, that's gotten much worse. But there were still some aspects of our lives that seemed, well, if not friendly to conservative ideas and principles, then at least neutral. Corporations were probably the best example of this. Many business leaders, for one thing, were themselves pretty conservative. They appreciated the message of low taxes, small government and light regulation. But more importantly, companies had a strong interest in not being overtly political. They wanted their products and services to sell to as wide a customer base as possible. Alienate half your potential buyers with a political stance and you risk losing business. But in the last 10 years or so, something quite remarkable has happened to American capitalism. US corporations have gone woke, as the current terminology has it. You see it everywhere. You saw it in the virtue signalling by CEOs last year after the murder of George Floyd and their express support for Black Lives Matter and its anti-police message. The denunciation this year by Delta Airlines and Coca-Cola of Republican Georgia's efforts to make modest changes to its voting rules. On top of all this, companies have become aggressive in presenting themselves as tribunes of progressive ideology. So-called ESG investing, which stands for environmental, social and governance, has become the big thing in finance, with companies falling over each other to demonstrate their commitment to green energy and, of course, the big new trend, diversity, equity and inclusion in their ranks. All this is profoundly undermining, actually, of capitalism. Since the formation of the joint stock company more than 200 years ago, companies have had as their primary goal the aim of producing profit for their owners, their shareholders. That's been a remarkably efficient system that is the very core of capitalism, and it's lifted literally billions of people around the world out of poverty. But chief executives have now decided that profits aren't the most important thing after all. Their job is to look after the so-called stakeholders, a nebulous idea which includes something like some obligation to the wider society in which they function. How did we get here? And what are the consequences of this woke corporate revolution? Vivek Ramaswamy has seen the woke revolution in corporate America at first hand. In 2014, he founded Roivant, which is a highly successful life sciences company. But like many tech leaders, he found himself under pressure from peers and employees and others to go woke. He declined. He stepped down from the company and is now a leading voice against one of the most troubling political developments of recent years. He's written a book about the phenomenon, and it's published just this week. It's called Woke Inc. Inside Corporate America's Social Justice Scam. Vivek Ramaswamy joins me now. So let's first of all explain to us what the woke corporation is. What does it mean?
Yeah, it's a company that decides to use its platform in the market and use its market power to also advance social values. That's the new game in the woke capitalist infrastructure, is to combine the pursuit of profit with the pursuit of social justice for the benefit of big business itself. As I say, Jerry, in the book, it's sort of a magic trick, which says that you pretend like you're pursuing something other than profit and power precisely to gain more of each.
And it's everything. Examples obviously abound, from, Delta Airlines criticizing the decision of the Georgia state to change its election laws, to companies coming out in support of Black Lives Matter and all of that kind of stuff. And we live in the age, don't we, of the almost sort of universal woke corporation.
It's absolutely ubiquitous. It actually dated back even a little bit further than the fever pitch it reached this year, to late 2018, when the Business Roundtable, late 2019, I should say, when the Business Roundtable, the largest lobbying group in the United States, changed the purpose of the corporation to include not just servicing shareholders by selling products for profit, but to servicing stakeholders. And that's really the stakeholder capitalism trend that first began. Airbnb said it would compensate its executives not just based on its shareholder-oriented goals, but how it serves its stakeholders. Goldman Sachs declares it won't take a company public unless its board is sufficiently diverse. And suddenly every company in America, Jerry, is piling on that train. That trend of stakeholder capitalism then became a vector for advancing what we call modern woke values of identity politics. And that was truly the birth of the contemporary woke capitalism as we know it.
The subtitle of your book, Vivek, is The Social Justice Scam by Corporations, and I'm fascinated by that. Explain why it's a scam. Explain what they're really up to.
Yeah, so look, the basic rule is big business is actually able to use the progressive smokescreen as a way of deflecting accountability from their own business practices. See, if you're Raytheon and Lockheed Martin, there's nothing woke about making ballistic missiles that kill thousands of people. But the number one commandment in the rules of woke capitalism, Jerry, is that the more ruthless your business actually is, the more woke you have to act in order to cover it up. And the same thing with Coca-Cola. You'd much rather be talking about voting laws in the state of Georgia or teaching your employees on how to be less white than you would about talking about your own product's impact on the nationwide epidemic of diabetes and obesity, including in the black community that they profess to care so much about. Same with Nike. Easy to criticize slavery 250 years ago in the United States than it is to reduce your reliance on it in China today. So that's part of what the scam is all about.
And you make a very good point there, and you raise it there, that they're very happy to weigh in on major social and political issues in the US, but they remain absolutely silent when China is persecuting millions of people in the country, when it's threatening other countries around it, when it's denying its citizens, the freedom of basic freedoms. These woke companies don't seem to care about what China's abuse is. They only care about the supposed abuses that go on in the US.
You're absolutely right. And actually, this is one of the things that I expose in the book that needs to be said, which is that isn't an accident, Jerry. China understands this game far more deeply than any of us do. There's even a new Chinese word for wokeness, baizuo, literally refers to woke white people in the United States, and they use it to laugh at us. But even worse, they're now using it as a geopolitical tool to erode the moral standing of the United States on the global stage, because now we have this new international class of moral arbiters, global companies. So when China shows up to the EU and they press them on the Uyghur human rights crisis, the first thing Xi Jinping says is that Black Lives Matter shows that the United States is no better, which would be ridiculous if it weren't for the fact that Disney and the NBA and Marriott and BlackRock and Goldman Sachs are all criticizing the United States without saying a peep in China. So I'm afraid to say, Jerry, it's actually working out well for them, where they've turned these multinational corporations into Trojan horses that bark at the United States while supplicating like lapdogs to their true CCP overlords.
Very well put. Vivek, we've got to take a quick break. When we come back, I want to ask you, how do we get here? How do we go from a situation where companies were supposedly about pursuing profit and to this situation we have today where they're about changing the world? Stay with us. We'll talk more about it.
After the '08 crisis, corporations, in the eyes of most Americans, were the bad guys. Big business, Wall Street, they were responsible for the financial collapse. They were responsible for getting a bailout when things went bad, even though they made money when times were good. And I understand the public frustration. But right around that time, there was the birth of a new theory on the left, the new woke theory, which said that the real problem in America wasn't just economic injustice. It wasn't just poverty. No, it was racial injustice and misogyny and bigotry.
I'm back with Roivant Science founder Vivek Ramaswamy talking about his new book, Woke Inc. Inside Corporate America's Social Justice Scam. Vivek, I studied economics. You went to business school. You founded your own company. I thought it was pretty clear what companies were supposed to do. They were about the pursuit of profit. They were, you had owners of companies and managers of companies. Managers were accountable to the owners, and the job was to pursue profit. And everything from Adam Smith, everything we know in, the success of capitalism, from Adam Smith onwards, it's the pursuit of profitable enterprises and opportunities. That is the way in which companies grow. It's that capitalism that's lifted billions of people literally out of poverty around the world. How do we go from companies doing what they do very, very well, pursuing profit, to this situation we have today where they feel it's their obligation and their right to weigh in on every single political issue?
Well, I love capitalism, Jerry, but I also learned to be wary of it back when I got my first job in the fall of 2007, before the 2008 financial crisis. Wary of capitalism when it gets intermingled with politics, as it did after the 2008 crisis. And I actually think that's when this story began, where after the '08 crisis, corporations, in the eyes of most Americans, were the bad guys. Big business, Wall Street, they were responsible for the financial collapse. They were responsible for getting a bailout when things went bad, even though they made money when times were good. And I understand the public frustration. But right around that time, there was the birth of a new theory on the left, the new woke theory, which said that the real problem in America wasn't just economic injustice. It wasn't just poverty. No, it was racial injustice and misogyny and bigotry. And guess what, Jerry? That actually presented the opportunity of a generation for Wall Street and big business, because now they could go from being the bad guys to actually becoming the good guys if they just used their market power in service of advancing those new progressive values. And so banks were happy to applaud diversity and inclusion or muse about the racially disparate impact of climate change or whatever it is they do in Davos. But meanwhile, they were actually able to deflect accountability and public ire for the financial crisis. So as I like to say it, as I say in the book, a bunch of woke millennials got together with a bunch of the big banks. Together, they birthed woke capitalism, and they put Occupy Wall Street up for adoption. And it has worked masterfully over the last decade.
It's fascinating. It's a kind of classic case of misdirection, right? Like the sort of three card trick that your eyes are.
It's a feigned retreat. In warfare,
and we're supposed to focus on race when actually these companies are, being allowed to get away with all kinds of abuses. Now, there are those people who will say, Vivek, look, what's wrong with companies? Look, companies are run by humans. Companies do have responsibilities. They have wider responsibilities in the world. They have responsibilities to their employees. They have responsibilities to their customers. What's wrong with companies taking those into account in pursuing these objectives? And by the way, a lot of customers want their employees particularly, and customers like these companies to do these things. They're pressing these companies to, take Ben and Jerry's or whatever, refusing to sell ice cream in Israel, in the occupied territories.
Sure.
A lot of the employees like that. A lot of the customers great. That's why they buy those things. So what's wrong with that?
Yeah, so look, woke capitalism isn't one thing, Jerry. It's actually three things, as I point out in the book, and they're each different from one another. First, you've got the woke executive, who ultimately is using his or her position of authority in the corporation to use shareholder resources to burnish his or her brand by pushing their preferred values. There, the victim is the shareholder. That's different than actually now what we're seeing, where many investors and shareholders themselves are demanding that, hey, you, the CEO, ought to push these social values or else. And we're telling you that because we're the owner of the corporation. That's the rise of the woke investor, which is a totally different issue. There, the victim isn't the investor. The driver of the behavior is the investor. As I'll tell you in a second, I think the victim there is American democracy at large. But then the third issue is totally different, which you also brought up, which is woke consumerism, which in a certain sense is neither the investors nor the elites saying that this is what we want you to stuff down the public's throats. No, the public, in some senses, at least some segments of the public, is demanding that companies flaunt these progressive values because they want to buy from a company that shares those values. And that's the most complicated one of all, Jerry. I think that is an indictment of our modern culture, where we have an entire generation, my generation, if I may say, I'm a millennial, that is hungry for a sense of purpose, hungry for identity, and is finding a cheaper version of that identity through mixing the pursuit of profits, mixing morality with commercialism. And I think the right answer there is really filling that moral void with something far deeper. That's something I talk about in the book. But it is.
Vivek, we've got to take. I'm sorry to cut you off. I've got to take a quick break there, but I think it's very interesting. And one of your chapters in the book about how woke is the new religion, and you've just talked a little about that. But we've got to take one more very quick break. When we come back, I want to ask more about the threat that this woke capitalism poses to democracy, and also how we might be able to fight back against it. Stay with us.
I'm worried about the expansion of the role of corporations in society in a way that actually makes democracy superfluous in some ways in determining our societal values, because I think a democracy works according to a one person, one vote system. And under this new model of stakeholder capitalism, we're converting that one person, one vote system into a $1 one vote system, where the people who wield greater market power also wield greater power in the marketplace of ideas in our democracy.
I'm back with biotech entrepreneur and author Vivek Ramaswamy. Vivek, you mentioned just briefly, and I want to dig into this a little bit more, about how this is not just something that kind of annoys conservatives when we hear all these kind of woke companies talking about how we should be living our lives, but actually that it's a threat to the democratic system. That actually this is not. Companies are not empowered, or shouldn't be empowered in a democratic system, to be making political choices. Talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, this is where my argument is a little bit different than Milton Friedman's, Jerry, where Milton Friedman's worried about politics infecting companies to make companies less efficient in pursuing profit. I'm actually worried about the reverse. I'm worried about the expansion of the role of corporations in society in a way that actually makes democracy superfluous in some ways in determining our societal values, because I think a democracy works according to a one person, one vote system. And under this new model of stakeholder capitalism, we're converting that one person, one vote system into a $1 one vote system, where the people who wield greater market power also wield greater power in the marketplace of ideas in our democracy. And I don't think it should just be conservatives that are bothered by that. Maybe they are today. I think the left should be every bit as worried, because you're on the left. You didn't like Citizens United in 2010 because it permitted corporations to influence elections? Well, guess what? This is Citizens United on steroids because it demands that companies use their market power to exercise political power. And that's a betrayal of what democracy is supposed to be all about. In fact, part of what America represents is that, for better or worse, we don't have a small group of elites that get together behind closed doors and decide what's best for society. We do it in the open through our democracy at large. And the last thing I would say, Jerry, is democracy also depends on solidarity, on bringing people together in the private sector, in the baseball stadiums of this country, in the football stadiums of this country. Right. And as those institutions become political, we lose the apolitical spheres that bind us together, even though we're a divided polity. And once we've lost those apolitical spaces in our private sector, I think solidarity itself is lost in our democracy, and that's a precondition for democracy to function.
And finally, Vivek, what do we do to roll back this woke revolution in corporations? I mean, it seems to be there's a bit of a backlash against some aspects of the kind of woke revolution, against critical race theory and attacks on the police and that. We're seeing a bit of a backlash, I think, in the country. How would this but it's so entrenched in companies now. How is it going to be dislodged? What can we do?
So, look, I think there are some policy solutions that we need to put at the top of the policy agenda. I talk about those more in the book, legal solutions. I'm not going to talk about those here, Jerry. You viewers can read the book for that. I actually think those are just a form of symptomatic therapy. What we really need in this country is a cultural cure. I don't think we even have a good answer today, Jerry, to the question of what it even means to be an American in the year 2021. And when you have a black hole that runs that deep, that's when bad things start to fill the void. That is what makes wokeism so appealing. That is what makes it effectively opium for the American soul. And I think that the hard work we need to do is to fill that void with a richer, more unifying cultural identity of what it means to be an American that runs so deep that it doesn't cancel wokeism in return, as some on the right are wont to do, but rather dilutes it to irrelevance through a rich meaning of shared patriotism, shared identity, shared faith that effectively makes wokeism irrelevant by comparison. And that's really hard work that begins with our citizenry, not in corporate America.
Vivek Ramaswamy, it's an absolutely terrific book. Congratulations on it. I thoroughly recommend everybody go out and get a copy. It's called Woke Inc. Inside Corporate America's Social Justice Scam. Vivek, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you, Jerry.